Let's start with the dangerous and slowly work our way towards the most deadly outlaws on the list. Number 10. Clay Allison. Clay Allison was nothing short of a wild man, a notorious gunfighter who earned a reputation for being extremely violent. Like in 1870, when Allison led an angry mob to the local jail to break out a man named Charles Kennedy, who had recently been convicted of murder. He would break him out of his cell, only to lynch the man himself. But for Allison, the man was not dead enough. So he began to decapitate the man as well, placing his head on a stake and proudly displaying it at the local saloon, which of course traumatized all of the children who were coming in for a drink. Allison was such a wild man that he would oftentimes be seen riding his horse through town, completely naked, with nothing but his pistol on his hip. But my favorite incident was when Allison accepted a dinner with a man named Chunk Colbert. Chunk was a notorious gunfighter who was rumored to have killed 7 men up to this point. And it was no secret that Chunk wanted nothing more than to see Allison dead. Now, of course, Allison knew this, but he still accepted Chunk's dinner invitation nonetheless. While in the middle of eating dinner, out of nowhere, Chunk would jump out of his chair and quickly drawing his gun to shoot Allison dead, only to hit the edge of the table with his pistol, which prevented him from raising it up any further. And in one swift motion, Allison drew his weapon, shooting Chunk between the eyes. When asked by the locals why on earth would he ever accept dinner with a man he knew wanted to kill him, to which he replied, "Because I didn't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach." Number 9. Cherokee Bill. Crawford Goldsby, or better known as Cherokee Bill, was an infamous outlaw who was responsible for the murder of 8 to 13 men. Bill would become an outlaw in 1894 at the age of 18, when he would confront a man that had beaten up his brother. But once he was face to face with him, he realized he didn't want to get beat up as well. So he would just end up shooting the man instead. And from this point on, he would live the rest of his life on the run as a wanted criminal. Shortly after this incident, Cherokee Bill would join an outlaw group called the Cook Gang, which specialized in robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. Cherokee Bill's crime spree was long and involved many heinous crimes. But to better understand this man's insane work ethic, let's just take a look at a small section of his crime spree, starting with June 17, 1894, when Bill shot and killed Deputy Sheriff Sequoia Houston in a gunfight. Then 1 month later, Bill would even clock in for holiday pay, shooting and killing 2 men on the 4th of July. Then 2 days later, on July 6th, he was rumored to have killed a railroad worker. Then a few weeks later, on July 30th, Bill and the Cook Gang robbed the Lincoln County Bank in the Oklahoma Territory. As you can see, Bill's crimes were non-stop, and they would continue at this pace until the day he was caught, which came on January 31st, 1895. But even in jail, Bill's silver-tooth activities would continue, as he somehow managed to get his hands on a revolver. And in an attempt to escape, he would end up shooting a jail guard in the stomach and back. But it would all be for nothing, as he would be locked back up in his cell. And on March 17, 1896, Cherokee Bill, the most infamous outlaw of the time, would be hung for his crimes. And just moments before his execution, he was asked if he had any last words. To which he replied, "I came here to die, not make a speech." Which is just a total cop-out, since the man obviously had a fear of public speaking. Number 8. George Parrot. Now, most of the outlaws from the Wild West had some of the coolest nicknames. Names like Billy the Butcher, Shotgun John Collins, Pistol Pete, James Wild Bill Hickok, Kevin Black Eye McLuffin, Texas Jack, Bronco Bill, the Kentucky Cannibal. The last one might still be up for debate. But my point is, most outlaws had really cool names. But sadly for George Parrot, he got stuck with one of, if not the worst one, as he would be known as Big Nose George, or Big Beak Parrot. And with a nickname like that, it's no surprise that the man was very angry, and went on to commit some of the most disgusting crimes, from robbing trains, stagecoaches, and cattle, to the classic Wild West pastime, cold-blooded murder. And after many years of crime, it would all eventually come to an end. On August of 1878, Big Nose George and his gang would attempt to derail a train in Wyoming by removing a stake from the tracks. But to their surprise, they would be spotted by a railroad worker. Knowing that they had been identified, they quickly fled to Rattlesnake Canyon. But what they didn't know is that the gang was being followed by 2 lawmen. These 2 lawmen had a very unique set of skills, as they were specially trained to track criminals down. And as they began to track the faint footprints left by the gang's horses, they would eventually arrive at Rattlesnake Canyon, where they were easily spotted and murdered. After these killings, a large bounty of $20,000 was placed on George's head, which is over $600,000 in today's money. But it wouldn't be until 1880 that George would finally be captured. Once in jail, things would take a shocking turn when George would get his hands on a pocket knife and sawing off his shackles, which he used to smack the jailkeeper over the head and fracturing his skull, only to be held at gunpoint by the jailkeeper's angry wife, who was obviously very disgusted with what she saw. Her once ugly husband was now ugly and deformed. News quickly began to spread of George's escape attempt, and a large group of 200 people would rally and come to his rescue, breaking him out of his cell. Once he was set free, a rope was quickly tied around his neck and he was lynched. It turns out the group was an angry mob. George's skull was then used as an ashtray for many years, and his skin was used for a pair of shoes. Both his skull and shoes are now proudly displayed in museums. Number 7. Bill Doolin. Bill Doolin was an outlaw and founder of the Wild Bunch gang. They were responsible for multiple crimes, from robberies to outright murder. Doolin's crime spree mostly took place in the Oklahoma and Indian Territory and lasted from 1892 through 1896. But it wouldn't take long for the Wild Bunch to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful gangs in all of the Wild West, amassing an estimated value of $165,000, which would be over $5 million in today's money. Now, depending on when you're watching this video, that's about the price of a really nice single-family home or the price of a used pickup truck. The gang was so successful at robbing trains and banks, the states had no choice but to place large bounties on all of the members. They were wanted dead or alive. And by 1895, most of its members had been killed, either by lawmen or bounty hunters who were out seeking the reward. Bill himself would be captured and jailed on January 15, 1896. But just 6 months into his jail sentence, he would manage to get his hands on a revolver, sticking up one of the jail guards and forcing him to unlock the jail door and escaping, leading to a massive manhunt that would end with Bill being cornered inside of a farm. Surrounded by lawmen, he was ordered to come out peacefully, and a few moments later, Bill would walk out and shooting at everyone that surrounded him, only to be instantly put down with a shotgun blast. It turns out that a 1v20 is never a good idea. Number 6. Jim Miller. James Brown Miller, or better known as Killin' Jim or Killer Miller, was an outlaw, a professional hitman, and a lawman. Killin' Jim was a notorious gunman who is considered one of, if not the most violent man of the Wild West. It's estimated that he killed a minimum of 12 men, but some reports claim that the number could have been as high as 50. Those reports, of course, coming from Jim himself, which we can all agree is genius marketing. Now, some of these killings were justified as they were committed against criminals early on while he was a lawman. The others, on the other hand, were just unlucky, as those were just outright cold-blooded murder, with most of those taking place once he switched sides and becoming a notorious hitman, charging $150 per hit, which is about $5,000 in today's money. And for the next few years, Jim was hired to kill many men. And in 1908, he would get hired by 3 wealthy men to kill a former deputy U.S. Marshal named Allen Augustus. The plan was simple: pay Jim $1,700 to kill Allen, and once he was dead, the 3 men would acquire his land. So the following day, Jim would ambush Allen on his property, shooting him twice with a shotgun. As Allen was left to die on the floor, his wife would run to the scene. and in his final words, he would manage the strength to say the name Jim Miller. Soon, Jim and the 3 men that hired him were captured and arrested. They were all taken into custody to await trial. But word quickly began to spread that there wouldn't be enough evidence to convict the men for this crime, so the townspeople would take justice into their own hands, breaking all 4 men out of their cells and dragging them to a nearby barn, placing all of them on a platform with a rope around their necks. As the other 3 men cried and begged for their lives, Jim showed no emotion. He was just eager to get the show over and done with, yelling, "Let her rip!" and voluntarily stepping off his platform to hang himself. The rest of the men were not so brave and would be taken care of by the angry mob. Number 5. Sam Bass. Sam Bass was an infamous train robber and the leader of a gang called the Sam Bass Gang, a gang that would become famous when they pulled off the largest train robbery in American history. But before we get to that, let's first cover Sam's origins. Believe it or not, Sam tried to live an honest life, working many jobs. He was a cattle wrangler, a horse racer, an advertising sign spinner. Okay, one of those I might have made up.
Is your business struggling to cut through the noise of spam reports and distrust that's out there with telephony? You're not alone. Fortunately, we have answers, or more specifically, David Krasinski does. David is the Vice President of Trust and Identity Solutions with TransUnion. He and I had a fantastic conversation.
At one point, he would even work for the railroads, where he would load goods onto the carts. Sam could have continued to live an honest life if it wasn't for his gambling addiction, in which he accumulated enormous debts that he could not pay off, which is what led him to a life of crime. He would begin by robbing stagecoaches, but eventually he would put together a gang that would specialize in robbing trains. Using the knowledge he acquired while working for the train companies, he managed to pull off 4 consecutive train robberies outside of Dallas, Texas. But in 1878, Sam and his gang would pull off the greatest train robbery of all time, when they managed to rob a Union Pacific train, stealing $60,000 worth of gold, a value that is close to $2 million in today's currency. And after this robbery, the gang would immediately split up for good. The following year, in 1878, Sam must have gotten bored of being retired and rich, so he would put together a new gang. And on July 19th of the same year, they would attempt to rob a bank in Round Rock, Texas. A robbery that would have been successful if there hadn't been an outlaw turned informant in his gang. And once the gang arrived at the bank, a shootout broke out. With his gang being shot and killed, Sam would take off on his horse, escaping town. The following day, Sam would be found helplessly laying in a pasture north of town, covered in his own blood from a bullet wound he suffered the day before. He would be rushed back to town, where he would die the following day. Number 4. John Wesley Harden. John Wesley Harden had to have been the most psychopathic killer of the Wild West, committing his first crime as a child when he stabbed a classmate after a fight. Then in 1868, at the age of 15, he would take it a step further. When he began to argue with the man, but not wanting to risk being wrong, he would quickly settle the argument by shooting and killing the man instead. After the murder, he would go full Jason Bourne, killing 3 Union soldiers who tried to arrest him. And in 1871, while traveling up the Chisholm Trail, he killed another 7 people, then 3 more in Abilene, Kansas. And in the coming years, he would add an additional 4 men to his death list. By 1878, Harden had killed at least 20 men, but some reports speculate that it could be as high as 40. The murder of a former state policeman and a sheriff would be the ones to get him arrested. John Wesley Harden would then serve the next 14 long years inside of a Texas prison. After serving his time, he would eventually be released. And in 1895, in El Paso, Texas, Harden's girlfriend would get arrested for carrying a pistol. Harden exploded with anger, threatening to kill the officer who had arrested his girl. A few hours later, Harden would be spotted at the local saloon shooting dice, when a man walked behind him and shooting him in the back of the head. He would be dead before he ever knew what was happening. The man who had shot and killed him was the same officer he had threatened a few hours earlier. The officer simply did not want to take the chance to end up on Harden's death list. As for the officer, an El Paso jury would end up acquitting him for the murder of Harden, as they felt that he had done the town a favor. Number 3. Jesse James. Jesse James is perhaps the most famous outlaw of the Wild West. James' appetite for violence began at the very young age of 16, when he joined a guerrilla group called the Bushwhackers, which is not at all what it sounds like. The Bushwhackers were a pro-Confederate guerrilla warfare unit during the Civil War and carried out some of the most atrocious crimes against Union soldiers and anyone who supported them. Let's just take a quick look at 2 of these incidents. Beginning with the Lawrence Massacre of 1863 in Kansas, where 150 unarmed men and boys were killed. Then there was the Centralia Massacre of 1864 in Missouri, where 24 unarmed soldiers were executed. A young Jesse James took part in both of these incidents. But now that you know exactly who Jesse James is, let's continue. After the Civil War had ended, Jesse, his brother Frank, and some former Confederate guerrillas would come together, creating a gang called James Younger Gang, which would soon become the most feared outlaw gang in all of American history. The gang would first begin by robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. Now, the reason this gang was so feared was, well, they never hesitated to kill anyone who got in their way. The door guy at the bank, the bank teller, the man who just happened to walk into the bank while they were robbing it, the little orphan who previously got squished crossing the road in my second video. The James Younger Gang terrorized the US from 1869 through 1879, robbing over 20 banks and countless trains during this time. Now, the crazy part is that Jesse James and his gang were treated like local celebrities, since they were seen as standing up for the Confederate movement. They were constantly sensationalized and romanticized in the newspapers, which garnered them a ton of local support. It actually got so out of hand that when the gang robbed the banks and stagecoaches, crowds would begin to form and watch from the sidelines, hoping to get a peek. But after 10 long years of crime, the gang would finally dwindle down, as many of the members began to die in shootouts. And by 1879, only Jesse and his brother remained. With the bounty on Jesse's head becoming larger and larger, he would ask the Ford brothers to move in with him, as the brothers were the only 2 people he trusted, as they had been members of his gang in the past. They agreed to move in. And on the morning of April 3rd, 1882, while James was hanging a picture frame up on his wall, one of the brothers shot him in the back of the head. The 2 brothers collected the reward money shortly after, and were later exonerated for the murder. Number 2, Billy the Kid. Henry McCarty, or better known as Billy the Kid, was an outlaw and a deadly gunfighter. Billy the Kid's life would dramatically change in 1874 at the age of 15, when his mother would die from tuberculosis. Their stepfather, not wanting to raise Billy and his brother alone, would end up abandoning them, leaving both of the boys orphans. With no one to look after them, they began to steal food to survive. Eventually, Billy would be caught by police for his robberies and placed inside of a local jail. During the night, Billy somehow managed to shimmy up the cell chimney and escaping from his cell. And from this day to the day that he died, Billy would remain a wanted fugitive. For the next few years, he would join multiple gangs, committing many crimes, from robberies to murder. He would even be arrested several times. But by the early 1870s, Billy would settle down working an honest job as a cowboy for a man named John Tunstall. John was a businessman who had many enemies in the business world. And in 1878, with the help of the town's sheriff, those enemies sent a large group of men to seize John's cattle. As John went to confront the men, the group would end up shooting him in the chest, knocking him off his horse. As he laid on the floor, one of the men would walk over to him and executing him with a shot to the back of the head. Little did these men know, they had all but sealed their fates. This incident would mark the start of the Lincoln County War. A group called the Regulators was created. The group's goal was simple. They swore to kill every single man that took part in John's murder. Billy the Kid was one of those members. It didn't take long for the Regulators to begin getting their revenge, starting by killing the 2 gunmen that murdered John. And in 1878, the Regulators would ambush the town's sheriff and his deputies, killing them all in a shootout. The Lincoln County War would last for around a year, with many killings taking place. After the war was over, Billy the Kid would become a wanted man for the murder of the town's sheriff, and in 1880 he would finally be captured and jailed. He would be sentenced to hang for his crimes. But Billy had other plans, and on April 28, 1881, he would get into a fight with one of the jail guards, stealing his revolver and killing him. Then from the second story, Billy would taunt the second jail guard when he yelled, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get." And the moment the second jail guard looked up, he was blasted with a shotgun that Billy acquired from their office. Billy the Kid had managed to escape from jail once again. A $500 reward would be placed on Billy the Kid. He was wanted dead or alive. Many men and bounty hunters began to track him down, and on July 14th, 1881, Billy's luck would finally run out when he would be killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett with a shot to his chest. Billy the Kid would go down in history as one of the most legendary outlaws of the Wild West. It's speculated that Billy had killed around 21 men during his short time on Earth and was just 21 years old at the time of his death. Number 1. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh are 2 of the most famous outlaws of the Wild West, but most will know them by their nicknames, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The reason why they're both in the number 1 spot is because they would become partners. But before we talk about how they became Wild West legends, let's first cover the origins of Butch Cassidy, the man who would become the leader and founder of the Wild Bunch Gang, a name that was inspired by Bill Doolin's gang, which we covered in the number 7 spot. Butch began committing crimes at an early age, from stealing cattle to minor offenses. But it wouldn't be until June 24th, 1889, that he would cement himself as one of the most brilliant outlaws the world had ever seen, when Butch and 3 others successfully robbed the San Miguel Valley Bank in Colorado, escaping with around $24,000, which is equivalent to around $800,000 today. The reason why a robbery this large was successful was thanks to Butch's meticulous planning, as he scouted the targeted area for weeks, taking every single escape route into consideration. Butch also had custom leather bags made to withstand the weight of the loot that was to be collected. He would also create an escape system where multiple horses would be stationed along the escape route, creating a relay system of fresh horses, guaranteeing that anyone pursuing them would not be able to keep up. Butch simply left nothing to chance. Tactics like this were the reason Butch and the Wild Bunch Gang were successful in robbing multiple banks and trains for over a decade. Now, the most shocking part is that Butch and the Sundance Kid never shot or killed anyone during these robberies. But after a decade of crime and the increasing pressure from law enforcement, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were forced to leave the country, making their way into Bolivia, where they would end up getting into a shootout with Bolivian soldiers. And both Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would end up dying in that battle. The men were then buried together at the local cemetery. Well, at least that's how the story goes. You see, in the 1990s, their bones' DNA was examined and were attempted to be matched with the DNA of their living relatives. But there was a problem. Neither of their DNAs were a match. The bodies of the 2 men that supposedly died in a shootout in Bolivia were not Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, with some even speculating that both men survived the night of the shootout and returned back to the United States shortly after, living the rest of their lives as wealthy men under a new identity. They might not have been the most dangerous outlaws of the Wild West when it comes to killings, but as far as the banks, the trains, and the government were concerned, there never existed a deadlier gang than the Wild Bunch.
Oh my gosh, put it out! Mom, hurry! Towel, yes. Hurry, I'm trying to open it.
Let's start with the lesser known pirates and slowly work our way towards the most notorious ones on the list. Number 7. Captain Kidd. William Kidd, better known as Captain Kidd, is perhaps the goofiest pirate of all time. Kidd was a privateer, which means he was a legal pirate hired by the government to hunt and invade enemy ships. He worked for England and the American colonies and was active from 1695 to 1698. In 1696, Kidd and his crew passed a Navy yacht and failed to salute them, which was required by naval protocol. The Navy yacht fired a cannonball near Kidd's ship as a warning that they must show respect and salute them. But instead, Kidd turned around and smacked his cheeks repeatedly in their direction. Now, as funny as he thought he would not be laughing for very long, as the Navy vessel's captain retaliated by drafting the majority of his crew into the naval service. Kidd would go through multiple crews in the coming years and was well known for being a harsh captain, like when one of his crew members insisted that they invade a passing ship, to which he refused, calling his crew member a lousy dog. His crew member quickly clapped back with, "If I'm a lousy dog, it is because you made me one." Kidd responded by dropping a steel bucket on his head, cracking his skull and killing him. Captain Kidd's biggest accomplishment was the capture of the Quedagh Merchant, an Indian ship that was carrying expensive fabrics, gold, and silver. But there was a problem. The ship was not an enemy ship, and had even paid England for safe passage. This incident would mark the beginning of the end for Captain Kidd, as he was labeled a pirate and became a wanted man. He was captured on July 6, 1699, and was later sentenced to hang for piracy and murder. Captain William Kidd was hanged on May 23, 1701. But hold on. As his body dropped, the rope snapped. With his body hitting the floor, he was knocked into a daze. Onlookers, shocked by what had just happened, began to surround him and called for his release, as the rope snapping was seen as a sign from God. He was quickly retied, hung, then gibbeted. Number 6. Black Bart. Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart, was a Welsh pirate and one of, if not the most successful pirates of all time. In his short pirating career spanning from 1719 to 1722, he managed to capture over 400 ships in the water spanning from the Americas to the West African coast. Black Bart captured ships mainly through intimidation tactics, since he typically had 200 to 400 men with him. They raided ships and gave the sailors the choice of either giving up everything on board or giving up their lives and everything on board. Black Bart is also known for popularizing the skull and bones flag, which he flew on his flagship, the Royal Fortune. He raised it just moments before raiding a ship, striking paralyzing fear into anyone unlucky enough to see it. Now, having a ton of men and resources was not the only reason Black Bart was so successful. He was well known for being a very strict leader and even created his own set of rules, known as the Pirate Code. For example, his Pirate Code stated anyone caught stealing from another crew member or deserting the ship during a battle would be punished by marooning. This meant that they would be left alone on a deserted island to figure it out. Most didn't. But after 3 years of pirating, on February 10th, 1722, Black Bart's luck finally ran out. While out at sea, they were spotted by a British warship, and a battle ensued. Shortly after the battle began, Bart was fatally wounded by a shot that struck his throat. As his lifeless body lay on the deck, his crew wrapped him up in a sail, weighed him down, and tossed him overboard, keeping their end of the promise. Bart had stated many times that when he inevitably died, his final resting place was to be the sea. His body was never found. As far as the men on board, those who survived were taken back to England and charged for piracy. Number 5. The Gentleman Pirate. Stede Bonnet, better known as the Gentleman Pirate, has one of the most unusual stories as far as pirates go. Born into a wealthy English family on the island of Barbados, while most men turned to piracy for a slim chance of gaining wealth, Bonnet embarked on his pirate journey in search of adventure. Now, most pirates acquired their ships by seizing them, but not Bonnet. He had the money to have one custom built, naming it the Revenge. Bonnet then assembled a crew of 70 men, heavily relying on them to navigate the seas, since he had zero experience or knowledge. This, as you can imagine, resulted in his men having little to no respect for him. Typically, pirates were paid by splitting the loot they acquired from seized ships, but not Bonnet's crew. He paid his crew wages out of his own pocket, buying their friendship. Now, I know this all seems very funny and seems like the guy just bought his way into playing pirate, but I promise this is where things begin to get interesting. Bonnet and his crew quickly found success along the eastern seaboard, capturing at least 8 ships. And just as he was warming up, he ran into a Spanish man of war. Outgunned, he lost half his men and was heavily injured. Fleeing the fight, he ended up in the Bahamas. There, he met and teamed up with one of the most infamous pirates of all time. But for now, we'll keep his identity a secret. Together, they seized at least 11 ships before going their separate ways. Seeing how the new leader operated, half of Bonnet's crew abandoned him, choosing to join the new crew instead. Now, in a surprising turn of events, under King George's Act of Grace, any pirate could be pardoned of their crimes on the condition that they give up piracy forever. Bonnet accepted the offer, but had no intentions of actually stopping. He simply changed his name and the name of his ship, as if no one would ever notice. A few months later, he was captured and brought to Charleston, South Carolina to face charges for piracy. But Bonnet had other plans. He ended up escaping, just to be recaptured, hung, and gibbeted. Bonnet's body was later buried in the marsh below the waterline in an unmarked location. To this day, his exact resting place remains a complete mystery. Number 4. Charles Vane. Charles Vane is perhaps the most ruthless and violent pirate to have ever lived. Where other pirates are known for their successful raids, Charles Vane is known for being an absolute menace, as he routinely beat, tortured, and interrogated sailors whom he captured. Much of Charles Vane's life is shrouded in mystery, but what is known is that he rose to power and achieved the rank of captain in the Bahamas around 1717. Later that same year, Vane was captured by a British Royal Navy officer, but was released when he claimed he was accepting King George's pardon and giving up piracy forever. With a clean slate, Vane didn't waste time destroying it and began raiding and capturing ships around the Bahamas, turning pirate once again. As he had captured many sailors during this time period, and in an attempt to gain information, he would viciously torture them by beating, cutting, burning, and eventually hanging them. On one occasion, Vane sailed to Charleston, South Carolina and stole a ship that was full of slaves, which must have been a great sigh of relief for the slaves, seeing that they were leaving the South, just to find out that the ship had been taken by Charles Vane. On November 23, 1718, while out at sea, Vane and his crew spotted a large ship. Naturally, they raised the Jolly Roger flag to intimidate the ship into surrendering. They were instantly blasted with heavy fire as the ship raised the French naval flag, and in a panic, Vane quickly ordered the crew to retreat. Once they were safe, the crew turned on Vane, saying that retreat was the move of a coward. He was kicked off the ship with only a few of his men following him. For the next few months, Vane continued with his ruthless ways, capturing and looting ships as well as torturing and killing sailors. But in February 1719, Vane was caught in a violent storm that left him and a few of his men shipwrecked on a deserted island. They would remain on that island for a little over a month, scavenging for food and barely surviving. When out of the blue, by some miracle, a ship arrived on the island to refill their water supply. Surprised and overjoyed, the men rushed the ship to beg for help. But it didn't work. Vane was quickly recognized by one of the men on board and arrested. He was taken to Jamaica, found guilty of piracy, and was hanged and gibbeted. Number 3. Long Ben. No pirate has left behind a greater mystery than Henry Every, better known as Long Ben. Henry Every went by many names: Long Ben, the Arch Pirate, and the King of Pirates. But I'll just refer to him as Every here. Every was an English pirate who operated in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in the mid-1690s. And in just 2 years, Every would manage to leave behind one of the most iconic legacies in pirate history. Unlike many pirates, Every first attempted to live a respectable life, joining the Royal Navy, then working on a ship for the slave trade. During this time period, he acquired the skills he would need to become one of the wealthiest pirates to ever live. While working for a Spanish expedition, the crew of men failed to receive payment for their services, so they simply took the ship. And Every was elected captain. Needing money to support their families, they turned to piracy. And for the next couple of months, Every and his crew seized many ships, which included 3 English merchant ships, 2 Danish ships, and a French pirate ship. But on September 7th, 1695, Every and his crew managed to pull off the most lucrative and bloodiest raid in pirate history. This happened when he joined forces with 5 pirate captains and their crews, amassing a combined crew of over 440 men. The men would then come together and vote Every as the leader of the newly formed group. The target was the Ganji Sawai, one of the largest trading ships at the time, which belonged to the Mughal Empire. As soon as they spotted the ship, Every gave the command to attack. Boarding the ship, hand-to-hand combat broke out. The bloody and gruesome fight would last for several hours, with many casualties on both sides. But eventually, Every and his men would be the last ones standing. They escaped with anywhere from 200 to 600,000 pounds and around 500,000 gold and silver pieces, a value of around 115 million pounds or approximately $143 million today. The men quickly split the money amongst themselves, with Every receiving a larger portion. As soon as news broke of the attack, the English and Indian government placed a large bounty on Every's capture, leading to the first worldwide manhunt in history. But here's where things get even more interesting. After the men split the loot, they all agreed to go their separate ways to avoid capture. Every told his men conflicting stories about where he planned to go to spend the rest of his life and enjoy his newfound wealth. After the split, inevitably, some of the men were captured and interrogated by authorities and gave up Every's final location. But each time authorities arrived to arrest him, Every was nowhere to be found. And for the next decade, rumors and whispers spread of people claiming to have seen him in many countries around the world. Yet, every time authorities arrived, Captain Henry Every was never there. Number 2. Ned Lowe. There's only one pirate that was so violent and sadistic that once you hear how he treated prisoners, it will make your stomach turn.
So let's say you have to read an incredibly long email from your boss that you have to finish before the big meeting starts.
Edward Lowe, better known as Ned Lowe, was one of the most feared pirates in history, and for good reason. You see, when pirates become notorious, it's usually due to their deeds and the treasures they amassed throughout their careers. But not here. Edward Lowe was very different. But before I cover what made him notorious, let's start at the top. Edward Lowe was an English pirate who was active towards the end of the golden age of piracy during the early 18th century. Lowe's life of crime began in childhood, pickpocketing, gambling, and stealing whatever he could get his little hands on. Eventually, he got sick of pickpocketing and thievery as a way to make a living, so he turned to burglary. A few years later, around 1714, he moved to Boston, Massachusetts as a young man. He got married, had a daughter, but sadly, things took a turn when his wife died during childbirth. Lowe attempted to make an honest living working on a ship that transported logs. But one day, everything changed when Lowe's temper got the best of him. While out at sea, he asked the captain for food, only to be told that all he had for him to eat was rum. Lowe, furious with the response, picked up a loaded musket and fired it at the captain, killing an innocent crewman that was standing right next to him. Lowe and around 12 other men were quickly forced off the vessel. The following day, the men led by Lowe took over a small ship, killing an innocent man on board. With a ship in their possession, they began their new lives as pirates. Lowe and his crew headed to the waters of the Cayman Islands. There, they joined the crew of a well-established pirate, George Lothar. But after a few months and many successful raids, Lowe was made captain and given his own ship, which he called Rebecca. This is when Lowe garnered his gruesome reputation and became one of the most feared pirates to ever live. Lowe created many torture methods that he would use on anyone he captured at sea. But I'll just cover some of his favorites and some notable acts. On one occasion, Lowe captured a French cook, saying that he was a greasy fellow who would fry well, then setting him on fire. Then there was the famous incident where he captured a captain, cut his lips off, cooked them, and made the man eat his own lips while they were still hot. He would also routinely tie sailors' hands with a rope, wrap it between the fingers, then set it ablaze, burning the person's flesh down to the bone. Then who can forget the time he killed 53 Spanish captives in a single day with his sword? But wait, there's more. There were also countless times where he would simply raid a vessel, tie the men up, take the loot, then set the ship on fire, burning everyone on board alive. Or the countless incidents where he would raid ships, take all their loot and food, then send them on their way to starve to death. But not only was he a complete bloodthirsty maniac, he was also a notorious cheater, approaching ships and hoisting friendly flags, tricking unsuspecting vessels into letting their guard down before attacking. But after 3 years of carnage and capturing and burning hundreds of vessels, in July 1723, Lowe sailed into the open sea and was never seen again. Some believe he died in a storm out at sea. Others say he was left to die on an island by his own crew. Then of course, there's the theory that he sailed to Brazil and lived the rest of his life under a new identity. Number 1. Blackbeard. I mean, who else could it have possibly been? Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, is easily the most famous, feared, and notorious pirate of all time. You can see his influence in modern films, TV shows, and video games today. And for good reason. Teach was an English pirate who operated around the West Indies and the eastern coast of North America from 1716 to 1718. Not much is known about his upbringing, and it wouldn't be until Edward Teach became Blackbeard that the world would really know his story. Blackbeard was a tall man, standing around 6'5", with a long, thick black beard that he braided. He wore a long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a bandolier across his chest, holding multiple handguns and daggers. Now, if that wasn't scary enough, the madman would also place slow-burning fuses in his hat, beard, and hair, lighting them right before invading ships, which was such a terrifying sight for sailors that they typically surrendered without a fight. The first account of Blackbeard came in the spring of 1716, when he emerged as a captain with a large crew of around 70 men. That spring, they traveled up and down America's east coast, capturing and ransacking 8 merchant ships. It was around this time that Blackbeard met and teamed up with Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, which we covered in the number 6 spot. Now, what really made Blackbeard famous was his capture of the La Concorde, a large French ship that was carrying around 500 slaves. After taking control of the ship, he released the crewmen and slaves on the island of Bequia, only for them to be recaptured a few days later.
Welcome to the Waverhood.
The Wayfair vibe at our place is Western.
My thing, darling? Shine.
Gardening.
With a new powerful ship, he renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge and equipped it with 40 guns. They then went on one of the most brutal looting sprees, traveling through the Caribbean Sea to Mexico, then up the east coast of the US, ransacking every ship they came across. This included a large merchant ship called Great Allen that secured him a spot in the Boston Newsletter, further growing his popularity and fearsome reputation. By this point, Blackbeard had already become one of the most famous pirates alive, but his biggest and boldest move came on May 17, 1718, when he stationed 4 ships outside of Charleston, South Carolina, just far enough at sea where they could not be seen from shore. There, they waited to ambush ships that were entering or leaving the port, and for the next 5 to 6 days, they captured and ransacked 9 vessels. This included a ship that was carrying Charleston citizens, whom he held for ransom, but eventually traded for a chest of medicine. And this is when Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet would go their separate ways. Bonnet would end up hanged shortly after, while Blackbeard traveled up north to North Carolina and accepted the king's pardon, agreeing to give up piracy forever. He made North Carolina his home and settled down, marrying his 14th wife. Now, of course, the story couldn't end there. You see, the entire time, Blackbeard continued his life as a pirate, with many suspecting that the town's governor simply turned a blind eye to it, as it brought economic benefits to the town. But eventually, the governor of Virginia had had enough and sent the Royal Navy to capture Blackbeard. And in the early morning of November 22nd, 1718, the ambush meant to capture Blackbeard escalated into a full-blown battle. The pirates were outnumbered 3-1, and the gruesome battle would last for around an hour. Blackbeard and his crew fought bravely to their last breath, but inevitably lost the battle. When it was all said and done, Blackbeard lay dead with 25 stab wounds and 5 gunshots. His head was cut off, then hung on the Navy's ship, with his body tossed into the ocean. Blackbeard's head would then be hung on a pole at the entrance of the Hampton River in Virginia, where it hung as a warning to pirates for several years. Blackbeard's terror lasted only a little over a year, but in that short time, he managed to seize over 40 ships, leaving behind one of the most terrifying and notorious pirate legacies in all of history.
We all have a job to do. You make Riley happy. Sadness makes her sad. Fear protects her from the scary stuff she can see. And my job is to protect her from the scary.
Let's start with the deadly and slowly work our way towards the ones that are pretty much a death sentence. Number 5, Mount Everest. Well, I bet you didn't expect to see this one at the top of the list. Mount Everest is one of the deadliest mountains on Earth, claiming the lives of over 340 people. Now, if climbing Everest is on your bucket list, you might as well delete it now. Not because you lack the discipline or the endurance, even though both are true, but because the mountain is exclusively for the rich, since climbing the mountain will cost you anywhere from $30,000 to $160,000. Now, of course, everyone who makes it back alive says that the high price tag is worth it, since it pretty much guarantees that you will always have something to talk about at cocktail parties. The cheaper packages will get you a Sherpa that has maybe made the climb once or twice in his life, while the more expensive packages will get you a Sherpa that has been making the climb since he could walk, and is strong enough to hike you out on his back if it comes down to it. But let's talk about what makes Mount Everest so deadly, starting with the dangers that you will encounter the moment you arrive. You can fall off the mountain, fall through the mountain, become the mountain, and the all-time classic, the mountain falls on you. If you're lucky enough to make it to the first base camp, well, you better get comfortable, since you will be spending the next 2 to 3 months there. And with no Wi-Fi or electronics, you will be going life and death with boredom, as your body slowly acclimatizes to the altitude change, a necessary step to lower your odds of getting altitude sickness. But after a couple of months, it's finally time to begin your journey. As you work your way from Camp 1 to Camp 2, 3, and finally 4, you will face an entirely different set of dangers. You see, the entire time you've been worried about the mountain trying to kill you, but the thing that could end up taking you out is yourself. Since it's very common for climbers to develop cerebral edema, a condition where the brain swells due to low amounts of oxygen, which can quickly turn deadly. Then there's high altitude pulmonary edema, which is a condition where the blood vessels in the lungs constrict, leading to fluid buildup, and again, can quickly become a death sentence. But let's just say you're one of the lucky few who make it to Camp 4 perfectly healthy, which is great since you're gonna need that energy for the final push to the summit, which also happens to be the deadliest portion of the entire mountain, and is where the majority of deaths occur. And as you push your body to its absolute limit, you will struggle to catch your breath through your oxygen mask. Soon, your lungs begin to scream in agonizing pain as they feel like they're on fire, with your legs, hips, and back feeling like they will give out on you at any moment. But you just continue to tell yourself, one more step, knowing that all suffering must eventually come to an end. And what felt like an eternity later, you finally reach the moment you have dreamed of and worked so hard for. You have successfully made it to the back of the line, where you will have to wait for hours and hours to get what you came for, which of course was always a picture you could use for your social media profiles. Number 4. Kanchenjunga. The danger quickly takes a massive jump from our last entry. Located on the border of Nepal and India lies the third tallest mountain on Earth, Kanchenjunga. The mountain has a hefty 21% fatality rate and has only been conquered by 312 people. Now, you're probably wondering, why on earth would anyone choose to climb a smaller and way more dangerous mountain than Everest? Well, it's obvious, since in the very rare case that you meet someone who has climbed Everest, you'll be able to say, "Psh, that's it," and walk away. Now, before we talk about what makes this mountain so deadly, let's first cover all the benefits of choosing this mountain over Everest. It's cheaper. And now that we've covered all of the benefits, let's talk about all of the negatives and what makes it incredibly deadly. Now, of course, you will be facing all of the dangers that come with climbing tall mountains, like avalanches, Let's start with the bad and slowly work our way towards the stuff of nightmares. Number 10. The Rat Dungeon. If you were alive in London, England during the medieval period, you would have definitely heard about the Rat Dungeon, since this punishment struck paralyzing fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. This was a cell that was located at the bottom of the London Tower, where prisoners were shackled and chained in complete darkness. But here's the thing, the dungeon was connected to the nearby river and just below the river's waterline, so that when the water levels rose, all the rats that lived along the riverbed would be pushed out of their shelters and forced to swim downstream. This would of course lead the hungry and angry rats towards the entrance of the dungeon, where they would then come face to face with the prisoner. But to the unlucky prisoner, he never actually saw anything, and all he would hear were the soft scurries of the rats' feet entering the dungeon. And in a matter of minutes, these soft noises were in the hundreds and all around him. These angry and aggressive rats would then begin to take small bites from the prisoner, who had no way of defending himself. Now, he might be able to shake the rats off for a few hours, but eventually the prisoner would pass out from pure exhaustion. And while he slept, the rats would continue to take bites from his flesh. Eventually, when he would wake up, he would discover hundreds of bites throughout his entire body. But it didn't stop there. The prisoner was left here for days or weeks on end, depending on his crime. But towards the end of the medieval period, this form of punishment just got more and more deranged, eventually becoming a form of execution, where prisoners would just be thrown in the dungeon and forgotten about. Number 9. The rack. This was yet another punishment that took place in the London Tower. The rack was a torture device that was used in many places throughout history. This form of punishment was originally designed for getting a confession, usually from criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war. The device looked like a large ladder, but instead of secure steps, they would actually rotate like a rolling pin. You see, when a prisoner was placed on the rack, he would have his feet and wrists tied to a ratchet pulley system, where 2 legal officials would slowly tighten the ropes and locking them in place, placing an increasing amount of strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows with every single turn. This was all done to get information, but of course, a lot of the times the truth was not accepted as reality, and the prisoner would then begin to say whatever he believed the officials wanted to hear. Sometimes it would work and the prisoners would be let go, while other times they would be tortured even more for lying. When the whole ordeal was over, prisoners were usually released with dislocated joints, but oftentimes they were left completely paralyzed. That was the case in England in 1447 when a 25-year-old girl named Anne Askew would be tortured on the rack for hours and hours on end and left completely paralyzed after all her joints were dislocated. She was then carried on a chair and burned alive at the stake. All this because she read and memorized scriptures from the Bible, which she preached in private to a small group of women, which were the exact women she refused to name and expose during her torture. You see, during this time period, if you followed any religion other than the Catholic Church, you better not say a word to anybody, including your own husband, which was the person that turned her in. Number 8. Keel hauling. This brutal punishment was carried out at sea on sailors who would steal or be violent towards others and would usually result in death. Keel hauling would start with a sailor having his arms tied with a rope, then looped around the entire circumference of the ship before being tied off to his feet. The sailor would then be thrown overboard while the group of men on board pulled on the rope to slowly drag him around the outside of the ship, including over the keel, which is how this punishment gets its name. But a lot of the times, the sailor wouldn't even have to worry about it, since they were dead before they ever reached it. Kinda just depends on how hard the guys on the rope feel like working that day. Not only would the sailors be drowning and getting their backs and necks broken on the keel, they were also getting sliced apart like a cheese grater by all the sharp barnacles on the outside of the ship. But if by some miracle a sailor actually happens to make it all the way around the ship without dying, one of 3 things will happen. 1. He would be sent for round 2, and for sure be dead by then. 2. Be freed and allowed back on the ship, where he would then slowly die to infections. Or 3. Live the rest of his life single and being made fun of, since he was now fully covered in scars from head to toe. Number 7. Crushed by elephants. Now we are getting to the part of the list where living is no longer an option. This form of punishment has been used by many countries throughout history, but was most recently used by India in the 19th century, which is really not that long ago if you really think about it. Like, your great-grandma could have witnessed one of these. What type of crimes would you have to commit to be crushed by an elephant, you might ask? Well, apparently if you failed to pay your taxes, that was good enough. And of course, stealing or being an enemy soldier was also a great way to become a tortilla. But the most disturbing case in history was when the 4th Mughal Emperor of India ordered an enormous amount of criminals to be crushed to death in a single day, simply because he was bored and needed some entertainment. The guy who forgot to pay his taxes, crushed. The man who stole an apple from the local market, crushed. The little orphan who jaywalked across the street, crushed. The man who murdered his neighbor and added his remains to a large pot of tomato soup, then fed that soup to his family and watched them eat it from the shadows with a creepy smirk on his face. He's alright. Apparently he makes a damn good soup.
If you paid more than $20 on tax preparation last year, you need to visit freetaxusa.com. where your federal return is always free and your state return is under $20. Get your refund the fastest way possible with Free Tax USA's free IRS e-filing and direct deposit. The website guides you through each area of your taxes, helping you get the biggest refund possible. Filing your taxes has never been easier. Visit freetaxusa.com today.
Honestly, guys, after the last couple of weeks of drinking this every single morning, I've been pleasantly surprised with the results. First big thing I would say is that I've noticed a change in my energy levels, definitely more energy. I also feel like my mood's been a lot better and my stress levels have been a lot lower than they typically are. And number two, I definitely want to say that I have noticed a pretty significant difference in my performance when I work out. Every time I slam this AG1 in the morning, I feel like I have already achieved something with my nutritional balance throughout the day.
There are a few ways that this public execution goes down, but one thing always stays the same. There's always a guy on top of the elephant controlling its every move. And this was very intentional, as this was meant to showcase just how amazing the ruling class were. I mean, look at them. They can control an elephant. Now be impressed. The first method of execution was the one that you better pray for if this was going to be your fate. Here, the criminals would have their arms tied behind their back and their heads placed on a pedestal, where it was then crushed like a grape by the elephant's foot. Now, the second method is much more cruel. The criminal would be placed flat on the floor with their arms tied behind their backs. Then the elephants would be guided to walk over the person's body, and hopefully the criminal would die on the first go. But sometimes they just end up crushing a leg or an arm, so the elephant then has to make a U-turn and try again and again and again. The final and worst way is when a highly trained elephant was guided to slowly crush the person limb by limb. They would first crush the arms, then the legs, and then poke holes in them with the tusk, until eventually dealing the final blow to the head or torso. This is the more theatrical route that rulers like the Fourth Mogul love to take, and made for a truly traumatizing experience for everyone. Except for the Fourth Mogul. He loved it. Number 6. Impel Min. Probably one of the grossest and most cruel forms of punishment on the list. This has been used by a few countries throughout history, but was most recently used in Egypt in the 17th century, usually against criminals that were highway robbers, grave thieves, or anyone who would try and start a rebellion. This punishment would start by having a criminal lay flat on their stomachs with their arms tied behind their back. They would then be sliced open with a razor to increase the size of their back door. And as soon as that incision was made, the cut would be lathered with paste to instantly stop the blood. They would then thrust in a long wooden stake that was the width of a man's arm, which was sharply tapered on one end. They then begin to hit the wooden stake with the mallet, pushing it further and further in. And of course, the stake was greased up beforehand to make this process a lot smoother. And once the stake has popped out of the criminal's shoulder, head, or mouth, they were pretty much long gone. He is then planted next to a busy road, like a Halloween decoration, to remind everyone that this is what happens when you break the law. They will be left there for the entire day and removed the following morning before the body begins to stink. But wait, there's another version of this as well. You see, on some occasions, the criminals would only be impaled just deep enough to keep them in place, but not too deep that it would cause immediate death. They would do this by having stakes that had a seated position on them to prevent the person from sliding down any further. They would then be placed on a busy road where they would suffer for hours and hours, pleading to people walking by for help, until eventually succumbing to their wounds. Number 5. Poena Koule. Poena Koule is Latin for penalty of the sack. And that's exactly what it was, just a lot more terrifying and cruel. This was an exclusive punishment for anyone that would murder their own family members. This was first seen in the 2nd century in Rome, but would later be used by the Germans in the 18th century. This all begins with a convicted murderer being placed inside a thick leather bag. But just to make sure the man isn't lonely, they would then add a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. I don't know what these animals did to deserve this, but hey, at least the evil family murderer doesn't die alone. Once all the animals are added inside the bag, it is then sewn shut, creating an almost airtight seal. Now you would think this would be horrible enough, but no. This is just the beginning, because as soon as the bag is sewn shut, it is then tossed into the ocean. But don't worry, later on, these murderers would be given the option to either be placed inside the leather bag or be sent to perform at the Colosseum, where they can perform the act of being mauled to death in front of all of their loved ones and peers. You know, at least they had the option. Number 4. Rats. This is one of the most sick punishments in all of human history, and it involves the use of rats. I will cover 2 of them here as they are very similar. The first use of this form of punishment dates back to 1568 during the 80 Years' War. A Dutch leader named Diederik Sonoy would often use this method of punishment, which involved placing a rat inside of a clay bowl, then placing it topside down on a prisoner's stomach, chest, face, or groin. Then the back of the bowl would be heated with either a torch or some coals, causing the rat to go into a full-on panic, trying to escape from the heat. And its only way out was to burrow into the human. Once inside, it would continue to chew and tear apart whatever was in its way, desperately searching for a way out. Eventually, the rat finds its way out of the maze and survives. The same could not be said for the prisoner. But the second method was much, much worse, and was highly secretive since it was used under the guidance of the dictator Augusto Pinochet, where he held power from 1976 through 1983. They called it the rectoscope, and I'm sure you have already figured out where this is going. Yes, it's exactly what you think. They would place a tube on a prisoner's back door, then insert a rat inside of the tube. The rat would then begin to burrow its way in. These people were so sick that they actually expected the prisoners to answer questions while this was going on. Eventually, the rat would find its way in and begin to move forward to find its way out. Nobody really knows how many people died from this punishment, but we do know that a ton of people went missing when this dictator was in charge. Number 3. Gibbeting.
Performing on the biggest stage in the world was just one step in my journey. Hi, I'm Ronnie, and I teach people all over the world how to dance with their dogs on my website. I was searching for a platform where I can really manage my business, and I found that in weeks. I'm so passionate about dogs and dog dance. It's the most amazing sport in the world, and the fact that in such a short time I was able to build my own business and reach so many people, that's something that makes me super proud.
3 of your ex-boyfriends died. Sure, a few of my exes are dead. I think I have to warn them. I do too. Roll on some deodorant and we'll head out.
The last known use was in the early 1900s in Afghanistan. This all came to light in 1921 when the National Geographic published this image in their magazine. This was also used in the United States from time to time during the 17th and 18th century. One notable example was in Boston, Massachusetts, where a few pirates were hung at the Boston Harbor, which served as a warning to any sailors that were approaching Boston. Now let's talk about England, since they love this form of punishment so much. In England, this was used on traitors, murderers, pirates, and thieves. But after the year 1752, the Murder Act was passed, which required that all convicted murderers must be put to death by being publicly dissected or by gibbeting of some sort. And over 134 confirmed people met this fate. The most common form of gibbeting were actually cages, and they looked like this. It was an all-steel cage that was shaped tightly to the form of a human body, which was so tight that it would not allow the person inside to move. They were then hung 30 feet or more off the floor, usually on a public road or waterhole, to ensure that the most amount of people could witness this monstrosity. But I could only assume this was more annoying than anything, since every time you get thirsty and needed to fill up your container of water, you would have to deal with the dying man begging you for a sip. Over here! But the annoyance and torture of the public didn't stop there, because after the criminals would die in the cages, the body would be left inside to rot for years and years on end, with the locals complaining that the smell of death was so pungent that they couldn't even sleep at night. There's even been reports that some human remains stayed inside of these cages for over 20 years, before a government official would finally remember to clean it out. Number 2. Scaphism. This was a form of punishment that was used by the ancient Persian Empire on anyone that would be convicted of murder. First, the criminal would be placed inside of a boat on their backs and tied down. The boat had 4 holes cut out so that the person's arms and legs would be outside of the boat and in the water. They were then force-fed large quantities of honey and milk until their stomachs were visibly full. They would then proceed to lather their entire body with the milk and honey as well. After all these steps were completed, he was then pushed out to the middle of the lake where he was completely exposed to the heat of the sun. But the sun would soon become the least of his worries. You see, the reason they fed him milk and honey was not because it was a great last meal, but because this combination causes the person to get extreme diarrhea, which mixed with the sweet honey attracts rodents, bugs, wasps, bees, flies, and whatever other animals live near the lake. After being tormented by the animals throughout the entire night, you would think that the daytime maybe gets a little better. No, because as soon as the sun rises the following day, the person inside of the boat gets another gigantic meal of milk and honey and an additional lathering. This would be done on a daily basis to prolong the punishment for as long as possible. It was also well documented that the rodents would continuously attempt to burrow inside of the person through their back door. They were probably trying to get a head start on their next meal. A writer named John Sonaris wrote in great detail about one of these incidents. He would go on to say that it was one of the most horrid and cruel forms of punishment since it was terribly long and seemed to have no end in sight. He wrote about a man who survived for an entire 17 days before he finally died from his wounds. Apparently, the man spent his last few days with his entire face completely covered with wasps, and his flesh rotting away filled with swarms of parasites and worms, all while being covered in his own filth. Number 1. The oubliette. Oubliette simply means to forget in French. This was a punishment that was used in many places throughout history, including in the London Tower, which had a small and confined room called Little Ease. Not only was this room pitch black, it was also so small that prisoners could not sit, stand, or lay down while inside it, and they would be left in this uncomfortable position for days on end. One of the most famous oubliettes is not the one in the London Tower, but in the neighboring district of Warwick, inside of Warwick Castle. Here, deep underground in the castle's dungeons, is a very small and narrow cell, completely made of stone, which has a metal door to close it shut. Prisoners were tossed inside of the cell and forgotten about, as the name implies. The prisoner would just have to sit there and wait for their inevitable death, which usually came in a few days from dehydration or starvation. Now, of course, this would be the best case scenario, because in reality, most of the time there would already be a rotting corpse inside of the cell to keep the new prisoner company. The previous occupier of the cell would serve as a daily reminder of his upcoming fate. But that's not the only companions that he will have, since the underground dungeons are completely infested with rats that have developed a taste for human flesh. But wait, there's more. These oubliettes existed in many of the castles throughout Europe, and in recent times they have actually discovered these dungeons with dozens, if not hundreds, of human remains inside of it, as proof that they were hardly ever cleaned. Like in Leap Castle of Ireland, where in 1900, during the castle's renovation, a worker found a small opening behind a wall inside of the chapel. This hole had an 8-foot drop that led to a large oubliette, and what the worker found inside shocked him, since it was filled with so many skeletons that they needed multiple cartloads to clear it all out. But just when you think this section is over, it just keeps on giving. You see, there's been many stories of men who have been placed inside one of these dungeons and kept alive for years and years on end, surviving off crumbs of food and minimal amounts of water, prolonging their inevitable demise for as long as humanly possible. These cells were sometimes even placed on ground level so they can hear the voices and laughter of the people outside. An experience that they will never get again in this lifetime.
Taxes was waiting. Now Taxes is a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes in a day, so you can get up to $4,000 instantly. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax.
Rolling in the mud? Tide Pods can handle it. Spaghetti night? Tide Pods can handle it. Stains are certain. so is the power of Tide. With 50% more cleaning power, it's got to be Tide.
Let's get the easy ones out of the way and slowly work our way up to the worst offenders on the list. Number 10, cats. This one is more of a misconception rather than an animal actually abusing a substance. If you have a cat, then you've more than likely tried giving them Nepeta cataria, or better known as catnip. Now, this one is not really a drug like the others on the list and is actually an herb that is very closely related to mint. But it does contain a compound called nepetalactone, which can have a mild and temporary stimulant effect on some cats. And that's the thing with catnip, some cats are affected by it and will go absolutely crazy for it, while others just remind you that you cannot buy their love and they still don't want anything to do with you. Now, catnip has many different effects on cats, but here are the most common ones. They will roll around in it, they will become very hyper after they ingest it, or they might just become very relaxed. Number 9, dolphins. This is another common one that most people have probably heard of. Everybody loves telling this story when they themselves are under the influence, so let's just get this one out of the way. Yes, it's true, dolphins are the real menaces of the ocean and are despicable losers who love to get high. They do this by first surrounding a pufferfish and proceeding to take turns lightly biting on it. Not only will they nudge and bite the pufferfish, the pod of dolphins will take it a step further by launching him out of the water and playing catch with him, making sure that that pufferfish is completely traumatized for the rest of its existence. And as you can imagine, this causes the puffer to go into a full panic, triggering its defense mechanism, releasing a toxic poison called tetrodotoxin, which is one of the most deadly poisons in the world. To put it into perspective, one pufferfish has enough poison to kill 30 adult humans, or about 15 average-sized Americans. Now, even though it's deadly, dolphins have learned exactly how much of the poison they can tolerate without dying. They've actually been filmed passing the puffer around for 20 to 30 minutes at a time before letting it swim off. The effects that the poison has on the dolphins is pretty interesting. They seem to go into a euphoric state where they become very calm and relaxed, even being mesmerized and completely fascinated by their own reflection on the surface of the water. Number 8, birds. Okay, now we're getting to the ones that most people have not heard of, but have probably seen firsthand. Have you ever come across a dead bird that crashed into a window or building? And you sit there wondering, how is it possible that it had unlimited airspace to fly around in, and yet still managed to crash? Well, the truth is that it was probably flying under the influence. This usually happens after the first frost, which causes fruits and berries to ferment, producing ethanol, a type of alcohol. And of course, birds know this. They will then proceed to eat as much of the fermented fruit or berries as they can to get completely hammered. And in certain parts of the world, bird alcoholism is on the rise. Just look at Yukon, Canada, where they have built a sanctuary for birds that have had too much of the booze, which is basically a drunk tank for birds. Here, they are placed in tiny cages until they sober up, but as soon as they do, they are released back into the wild where they can continue boozing. So next time you see a bird that isn't flying straight, just remember, he's probably a degenerate good-for-nothing alcoholic. Number 7, honeybees. This one is similar to number 8, as most people probably won't know this one, but once you hear about it, you'll realize that you've come across it at one point in your life. Now, this one is a little more violent and doesn't have the ending that you would find at a massage parlor. Have you ever come across a honeybee that's crawling on the floor and doesn't seem to want to fly? As a kid, I used to think that this was because the bee had recently stung someone and is now dying a horrible and painfully slow death. But now as an adult, I am way more informed. Now, when I come across a crawling bee, I now know that it's either completely blocked out drunk or dying a horrible and painfully slow death. You see, when the temperatures rise, the nectar in plants can become fermented, and you guessed it, it becomes alcohol. So when bees go to collect pollen from the plant and drink some of that sweet fermented nectar, they get completely drunk.